Let's continue integrating TypeScript into our JavaScript files, and in this lesson, we're going to work on the file timeline items. We're going to skip timeline item timer file for now because this module depends on the module timeline items. So I prefer to type timeline items file first. And this file encapsulates everything related to the entity timeline item. In our application, timeline item represents individual block on the timeline page. So let's start using types in this file. For the timeline item refs constant, we're not going to specify a proper type just yet, because in order to assign a proper type, we need to know how this constant is used in view component. So we're going to come back to this place later, and for now, I'm going to mark this place with an any type. The next constant timeline items stores array of timeline item objects. Let's take a look in the browser to see what shape timeline item objects have. If we take a look in View DevTools, we can see that every timeline item object contains 4 properties, and those are activity ID, activity seconds, hour, and is active. So let's create a new type to represent objects of such shape. We're going to use an interface and call it timeline item, and here we're going to list all those properties that we have just seen in View DevTools. And now for each of those properties, we're gonna define a type. So property hour stores individual hours. It will be a number type. Property activity ID stores identifiers of activities, and those identifiers are strings, but also this property might not contain any activity ID at all, so it can also be null. For activity seconds, we're going to assign number type, because this property stores amount of seconds, and eventually for the isActive property, we're going to assign boolean type. And after defining this type, we can assign it to timeline items constant. But of course, we also have to use square brackets, since this is an array of such objects. Moving on to the next computed property, activity timeline item. Here I'm going to specify an explicit type for the return value of the closure we're passing to computed function. As we can see, this closure can either return an object of type timeline item, or if such object will not be found in timeline items array, it will return undefined. So basically, this closure is looking for an active timeline item object inside timeline items array. And as for the return value of the closure we are passing inside find method, we use boolean type. Next one is a watcher. There we also have to assign the type. The watcher function is a generic function, so we can specify with values of what type it works. In this case, it watches value of the type date, so let's manually specify the type in here. And this way we don't need to manually specify the types for each of these parameters that we are passing inside this closure, because based on the generic type argument, TypeScript is able to automatically infer proper types for these parameters. Additionally, we'll specify the type for the return value, which will be void. Moving on, and the next function is initialize timeline items. As we can see, it takes one parameter, which is the state, and by the way, for the state, we have already defined a separate interface which describes objects of this type, and this interface looks like this. So let's use this interface in here and import it. And as we usually do when importing types, let's use keyword type right here. The return value of this function will be of type void, because this function does not return anything. And as for this last active add constant, we don't need to manually type it, because TypeScript was able to infer the type based on the assigned value, which is a date object. Moving on to the next function, update timeline item. As we can see, we have to explicitly specify types for these parameters. So the first parameter takes value of the type timeline item, and as for the second parameter, fields, we're not going to assign proper type just yet, but come back to this place later. So I'm going to mark this place with any type, because in this place we might use one of the standard TypeScript types, which we're gonna talk about in one of the next lessons. And eventually this function is going to return transformed timeline item object, therefore the return type will be timeline item. For the parameters of the next function, we're going to use timeline item, actually array of timeline item objects, and for the second parameter we're gonna use earlier defined type for activity objects. This type looks like this. So in here we're gonna use type activity and import it. Also, let's just combine these two import statements, because both of these types we're importing from the same module. Next, let's specify the type for the first parameter of the closure of for each function. So in here, the proper type will be timeline item. And let's add a type for the return value of this whole function, which is void, because this function does not actually return anything. And the same type we can specify as the return type for the closure of the for each method, like this. But here it's also important to use curly braces for this closure, otherwise return value of the function update timeline item will be taken as a return value of this whole closure. The next function, calculate tracked activity seconds, is basically going to have same types for parameters as the previous function. So the first parameter will have type timeline item array, and the second parameter will have type of activity. This function returns number type, and then we also specify type for the first parameter of the closure of the map method, which is timeline item object, and let's specify type for the return value of this closure, which is a number, because activity seconds property of timeline item object, as we can see, has numeric type. And for the closure that we are passing to reduce method, for parameters as well as for return value, we're going to use the same type in this case, which will be a number, like this. The next function takes two parameters, so the first parameter will be of type number, since it represents an hour, and the return value of this function will be void. And as for the following statement, as we can see, this statement references earlier declared array of refs called timeline item refs, but for now we don't know what elements these refs refer to. So I'm going to type this constant as any, and later, when we'll know for sure which elements those refs are actually referring to, we'll come back to this place and use a proper type for the constant EL. Moving on to the next function, reset timeline items. As we can see, this function does not return any value, so type of the return value will be void, and the same type we're gonna use in here as the return type for this closure. But also let's not forget and use curly braces in here. For the next function, we're going to use type date as the type for the first parameter last active at, and use type void for the return value. As we can see, TypeScript still highlights a couple of places in this function. That's because computed property active timeline item may not contain any value. So in here, TypeScript is actually trying to protect us from potential errors. So for the time being, let's just disable these errors by casting the type of this computed property to any, like so. And also let's do the same in this place. We still have a couple of functions left in this file. The next one is calculate idle seconds. The type of the first parameter will be date, and the type for the return value will be number. In the body of this function, TypeScript doesn't like that we are trying to apply subtraction operation to dates. There is actually a proper way how we can avoid this error, but for now, let's cast these dates to any. This way we're going to disable those errors. but definitely going to come back and apply proper fix in one of the next lessons. But for now we're casting each of these dates to any. The next function as the first parameter takes array of timeline item objects, and as a second parameter takes an activity object. And eventually it returns new array of timeline item objects. Let's also specify a return type of this closure we're passing inside filter function. So here the type will be Boolean. And finally we have reached the last function in this file, generate timeline items. This function generates array of timeline item objects, so the return type will be array of timeline items. And as for the return value of this closure, we're going to use timeline item type, because on every iteration, this closure of the method map is going to generate new object of timeline item type. So at the end, let's just apply formatting to this file and reorder imports. And just to make sure that our application still functions properly and we are not getting any errors in the browser, let's just click around a bit in here and verify that there are no errors. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.